At dusk, a stepmother drives into a rural Washington forest, ready to abandon her disabled child in the middle of nowhere. But a bear sees what happens and then does something unbelievable. The light was dimming in a rural Washington forest as the car came to a gentle stop. 10-year-old Greg sat in the back seat, his leg braces loudly brushing against each other. They were always a reminder of the challenges he faced every day and made Alisson cringe every time she looked at them. Alisson was Greg's stepmother. She looked back at him through the rearview mirror. His eyes were a turbulent mix of fear, sorrow, and a desperate kind of determination. They filled up with tears, and she bit down to fight them back. "We're just going for a little walk, Greg," she said. Her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. Greg was trusting and innocent and nodded. He struggled to unbuckle his seatbelt with fingers that weren't quite as nimble as he would have liked. Alisson got out of the car and opened his door. She helped him out, supporting him as he adjusted to his leg braces. She guided Greg gently as they walked deeper into the woods, but with an urgency that made her hands tremble. After a few minutes, she stopped. They were deep enough that the car was no longer visible. It had been swallowed by the thick foliage in the creeping dusk. "Greg, can you wait here for a moment? I need to go back and get something from the car," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper and strained with an emotion that she couldn't quite hide. Greg looked up at her. His eyes were wide and trusting. "Okay, Mommy," he said. Alisson knelt and kissed Greg's forehead. A tear escaped and trailed down her cheek. "I love you, Greg. I'm so sorry," she whispered, so quietly it was almost lost in the rustling leaves. Standing up, she took one long, last look at the boy, her heart shattered into a million pieces. Then, with a deep breath that felt like it was tearing her apart, she turned and walked back towards the car. Each step was heavier than the last. Behind her, Greg waited. The boy was a small figure in the vast, embracing arms of the forest. The mist thickened, and the sounds of the forest seemed to hush in anticipation of what was to come. As the distance between Greg and Alisson increased, so did the silence. Then, all that was left was the boy and the breathing forest. Alisson's car weaved through the narrow roads leading away from the forest. Her mind was a whirlpool of emotions. Inside her raged a storm of regret and despair. Each mile increased the distance between her and Greg, the boy she had just abandoned in the woods. Her life had been a relentless struggle. Born and raised in rural Washington, she had known hardship from an early age. She'd dreamt of escaping, of finding a life filled with opportunity and happiness. But those dreams were shattered and replaced by the harsh realities of life's unkind turns. Meeting Greg's father had seemed like a stroke of fate. He was her chance to build the family she always longed for. His sudden death, however, plunged her into a chasm of grief and responsibility she didn't feel ready for. Greg, his son from a previous marriage, became her charge. She'd tried to love him as her own, but his disability added layers of complexity she wasn't prepared for. The boy's needs were constant, and the medical bills and specialized care were more than she could afford on her dwindling savings and meager income. Alisson's mental health spiraled. The constant stress, the sleepless nights, and the relentless judgment from a community that prided itself on self-reliance left her feeling isolated and overwhelmed. In her weakest moments, she questioned her ability to care for Greg, and she was constantly tormented by the thought that she was failing him. The decision to leave him in the forest wasn't made in a moment of clarity, but in a haze of desperation and distorted logic. However, the universe seemed to mock her decision cruelly. Barely an hour after she left Greg, her phone rang. It was a call from a social services agency she had contacted months ago. For a while, this had been a distant hope. She'd almost forgotten about it. The voice on the other end was a mix of professionalism and warmth, offering her the lifeline she had desperately needed: financial assistance, medical care for Greg, and educational support. It could change her life. The news hit Alisson like a tidal wave. The help she had so desperately needed was now available, but it was too late. She'd already abandoned Greg and left him alone and defenseless. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. The realization that her distorted perception of hopelessness had driven her to make a terrible mistake was painful. She turned the car around in a frantic state. Praying, Alisson raced back to the forest. The sun had set, and the woods were a labyrinth in the darkness. Panic set in as she realized the unlikelihood of finding Greg in the vast wilderness. Her mind raced with fear for his safety and the consequences of her actions. She called out for Greg, but her voice got lost among the towering trees. The night grew colder, and the forest deeper as she ventured further in. Alisson was determined to undo her grave mistake, but the forest was vast, and Greg was just a small boy. The search would not be easy, and time was running out. Greg huddled under a large pine tree. His small figure was dwarfed by the vastness around him. The forest sounds were both frightening and mesmerizing. He clutched his teddy bear tightly and whispered stories to himself to ward off all the loneliness and fear. As the moon climbed higher, it cast silvery beams through the tree canopy. Then, a rustling sound caught Greg's attention. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. From the underbrush emerged a large figure. Fur glistened in the moonlight. It was a bear, its eyes fixed instantly on Greg. Fingers of cold fear gripped him, but, to his surprise, the bear did not advance aggressively. Instead, it tilted its head and observed him with a curious and almost gentle demeanor. Greg sensed no immediate threat. He remained still, his curiosity piqued by this enormous creature. The bear approached slowly. First, it sniffed the air around Greg. It seemed to sense his vulnerability and fear. In a gesture that seemed almost nurturing, the bear lay down a short distance from Greg. Its eyes never left the boy. The night passed with the two of them in this unlikely companionship. It was as if the bear's presence offered a sense of protection in the vast, dark forest. As dawn broke, Greg's initial fear of the bear transformed into a sense of wonder. He noticed the bear was a female. Her movements were graceful yet powerful. She ventured away occasionally, only to return with berries and fish from a nearby stream. She dropped her catch a few feet from Greg. Though hesitant at first, the boy accepted the offerings as his hunger overcame his apprehension. In the days that followed, a remarkable bond formed between Greg and the bear. She became his guardian in the wilderness. Her instincts led them to food and safe shelter. Greg named her Luna, inspired by the moonlight under which they had first met. He talked to her, telling her about his life, his lost father, and his stepmother. Luna listened, her brown eyes deep and knowing. In her company, Greg found a sense of peace he hadn't known before. The forest became a home of sorts for him, a wild sanctuary where he discovered a strength and resilience he didn't know he possessed. With Luna by his side, he faced each day with a growing sense of confidence and a newfound respect for the natural world around him. However, beyond the forest's protective embrace, Alisson continued her frantic search, unaware of the extraordinary friendship unfolding in the heart of the wilderness. Alisson's journey into the heart of the Washington forest was marked by an overwhelming sense of guilt and a desperate need for redemption. Her mind was haunted by the image of Greg, alone and vulnerable in the vast wilderness. With each step, she plunged deeper into the dense undergrowth, her determination fueled by a mix of hope and fear. She camped at night and searched during the day. On occasion, she ventured out of the forest to the closest town for supplies. But she always returned to continue her search. The forest was a labyrinth. Its paths were winding and deceptive. The towering trees seemed to whisper judgments, and their leaves rustled with the secrets of the woods. She was ill-prepared for the rugged terrain. Her sneakers slipped on the moist earth, and her clothes were snagged by branches. But the thought of Greg, somewhere out there, kept her moving forward. The challenges of the forest were relentless. She encountered wild animals, and the physical obstacles were equally daunting. Alisson had to navigate through thickets that seemed to grasp at her with thorny fingers. The streams she crossed were deeper and swifter than they appeared. Each step was an exercise in endurance and resilience. Her city life had not prepared her for this, yet she pressed on, driven by the need to find her stepson. As night fell, the forest transformed. The darkness was absolute, and the sounds were more pronounced. Alisson found shelter under trees. Their canopy offered meager protection against the elements. Then, exhaustion took over, and despite her fears and the discomfort, she would fall into a fitful sleep. Visions of Greg haunted her dreams. In them, he was always just out of reach. His face blended with the shadows of the forest. She awoke with the dawn, her resolve strengthened by the haunting images of her dreams. She couldn't give up, not when Greg needed her. Alisson's love and guilt drove her deeper into the wilderness, each step a mix of hope and fear. Unbeknownst to her, in a clearing not far ahead, Greg and Luna shared a bond that had grown strong in the heart of the forest. It was in this remote part of the woods that Alisson stumbled upon a sinister secret. Hidden among the thick underbrush, she found signs of illegal activity. There were traps laid out. Some contained remnants of unfortunate animals. She noticed tree markings and realized with a sinking heart that she had come across a poacher's den. This part of the forest was remote and undisturbed. It had become the base for illegal poaching activities. Fear and anger surged through Alisson. She realized the danger she was in, but also knew that this discovery could be crucial in finding Greg. As she navigated around the poacher's site, she heard voices. Her heart leaped. Among those voices, she could distinguish one that she had longed to hear. It was Greg, talking to someone or something. She followed the sound and broke into a clearing where she finally saw him. Greg was not alone. Beside him stood the massive figure of a bear. Alisson's eyes widened in disbelief at the sight of her stepson. There he was, safe and sound, in the company of a wild bear. Before she could step forward, a group of poachers emerged from the foliage. Their surprise quickly turned into aggression. They were rough, dangerous men, armed and clearly willing to protect their illegal enterprise. The situation escalated quickly. The poachers grabbed both Alisson and Greg. They were brutes, threatening the two to keep silent about what they'd seen. Fear gripped Alisson's heart. Beside her, Greg's face was pale but brave. It was then that Luna, sensing the danger to Greg, reacted. With a ferocious roar that echoed through the forest, she charged at the poachers. The scene descended into chaos. The bear's immense strength and unexpected intervention threw the poachers into disarray. This gave Greg and his Alisson a chance to escape. As they found safety behind a thicket, they witnessed a heart-wrenching scene. Amid the confusion, a young bear cub, previously hidden in the underbrush, scurried towards Luna. The realization hit them both. Luna had been protecting the forest not just out of wild instinct, but as a mother. The poachers had captured her cub. Luna had been on her own search. Suddenly, the bond between Luna and Greg took on a new, profound meaning. They were both lost and found in the forest. Luna had seen Greg as a kindred spirit, a young life in need of protection, much like her own cub. Alisson, overwhelmed by the unfolding events, held Greg close. Her heart swelled with relief and love. They had found each other again, and in doing so, had uncovered a crime that threatened the very heart of the forest. Their journey was not over yet, but they were no longer alone. Luna and her cub stood by them, a formidable family united against the threat lurking in the shadows of the forest. In the aftermath of a dramatic encounter with the poachers, Greg and Alisson found a moment of peace amid the chaos. They sat in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. Luna and her cub were nearby. Alisson looked into Greg's eyes and saw not just the boy she had left behind, but a young, resilient individual who had survived against all odds. Tears streamed down her face as she apologized to Greg. She explained her actions and told him how they were born out of desperation and despair. Greg listened. His eyes reflected an understanding far beyond his years. He told her about his time in the forest, of the fear and loneliness, but also of the strength and companionship he found with Luna. It was a heartfelt exchange, a moment of healing and understanding. For the first time, mother and son shared their true feelings. Alisson realized how much her journey into the forest had transformed her. She was no longer the overwhelmed, desperate woman who had left Greg. She had become a fighter, a protector. And now they knew they couldn't leave the forest without acting against the poachers. Using Alisson's phone, they contacted the authorities. She provided details of the poachers' operations while Greg described the location. The authorities arrived swiftly. With Greg and Alisson's help, they apprehended the poachers. The illegal operation was dismantled, and the forest began its slow process of healing. Luna and her cub were now safe. Greg returned home with Alisson, but he was not the same boy who had been left in the forest. The experience had instilled in him confidence and a deep connection to nature. Alisson, witnessing the change in him, supported his growing interest in wildlife and forest conservation. Together, they started working with local conservation groups. Greg became a young ambassador for the forest. He shared his story and the importance of protecting natural habitats. His unique bond with Luna and her cub became a powerful narrative that inspired many. Alisson, once consumed by her struggles, found purpose in this new chapter of their lives. Their journey had begun with a tragic mistake, but it led them to a path of redemption and purpose. In the forest, once a place of abandonment, had become a source of hope. It turned out to be a sanctuary where they had found themselves and each other. What a heartwarming ending! Would you have forgiven Alisson if you had been in Greg's place? Do you have a story where a wild animal took care of somebody lost in the wilderness? We'd love to hear it. Tell us in the comments. For now, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.